USA Today and Ipsos poll. 2 in 3 parents strongly support requiring mask and teacher vaccinations, despite the surge that we're seeing in pediatric cases. Joining us now to discuss is Vice President at Ipsos, Mallory Newall. Mallory, welcome to the show. Before we go further, talk to us more about the poll and what it reveals about parents and their sentiment around sending their kids back to school.
Sure, thanks for having me on. Our latest USA Today Ipsos poll comes at a really interesting time. As you just mentioned, cases among children are rising. And what we're seeing is that both parents and the general public alike are broadly in favor of mask requirements for students and teachers to go back to school. Our poll also showed some growing concerns among parents about online learning and their child falling behind. So perhaps it's not surprising that a vast majority of parents are in favor of schools reopening in person 5 days a week.
I'm curious what their thoughts are on going back to remote learning. Are some of these parents willing to go back to that? So many of us saw it last year.
Well, I think that this poll We actually conducted a similar poll at the end of the 2020 school year, so last May. And since then, we've found that fewer parents believe that their school district prepared their child well for online learning. And actually, more parents say that online learning caused their child to fall behind. So they're not necessarily opposed, but I do think that this poll really shows that there are some hesitations with continuing to learn remotely.
Let's talk about that hesitation, because what really surprised me from this poll is Black and Hispanic parents are not supportive on returning to school. That's surprising to me because of the disproportionate impact on minority communities. So can you break down, Mallory, why this is?
Well, actually, Black and Hispanic Americans, like everyone else, are in favor of schools reopening in person. Now, Black and Hispanic parents were somewhat more likely to say that their child fell behind on online learning. It's a small sample size, but still slightly higher than white parents. So overall, I would say that parents and the public alike are actually in favor and support schools reopening, albeit with safety concerns such as mask requirements and vaccine requirements in place.
Children under the age of 12, of course, not cleared yet to be given vaccines. How do parents feel about that?
One thing that really stood out to me in our poll that's really interesting is that there actually is support for a vaccine requirement, too. Support is stronger for teachers to be vaccinated before they return to the classroom, but a majority of Americans, including about half of parents, feel that eligible students should be required to be vaccinated before heading back to school.
What about kids older than 12? Are parents supporting the idea of a vaccine mandate for these kids?
Again, I think when you look at how we ask the question, what it comes down to is that there is support for requiring eligible students, now you could interpret that as kids who are 12 and over, to be vaccinated before they go back to school. I would say that support is higher for mask requirements, slightly higher than it is for vaccine requirements. But when you take it all together, what this poll tells us is that people are in favor of getting kids back into classrooms, but they really want to do so safely and with certain requirements in place.
We've seen cases in parts of the country where parents are clashing with teachers over these mask mandates. What case are they making here?
Well, I think ultimately, the case that these parents may be trying to make is that it should be up to the individual to decide. And we actually asked about that in our poll. We found that an overwhelming majority of Americans agree that it's up to the individual parent on whether or not they choose to send their child back to school, but less are in agreement when it comes to individual parents deciding about sending your child back to school in a mask. Actually, fewer than half agree that it should be the parent's decision to do so.
Fewer than half. That is such an interesting note. It looks like the poll also touched on how some parents supported certain teaching topics rather than others. Can you talk to us about that, Mallory?
Sure. We explored a little bit about subjects that are appropriate to teach in the classroom. One thing that I think personally is really interesting is when you ask people about support for teaching critical race theory, there's pretty mixed support. But when you ask people about teaching the history and the impact of slavery and racism in the United States, there's widespread support for teaching that in our schools. So when you strip away the buzzword and you focus on the topic area, we see that there actually is broad support for teaching that in classrooms.
It's all about the wording. Mallory, this is such a wide-ranging poll. Is there anything here that surprised you?
I think, honestly, one thing that really stood out to me is just how strong the support is for sending kids back to school, first of all, but doing so with mask and vaccine requirements in place. And it's actually not just parents that are clamoring for this. This is the American public. So public opinion overall has really strongly backed the idea of reopening classrooms across the country, but in a way that protects kids and does what they can to keep them safe from contracting COVID-19.
Vice President at Ipsos, Mallory Newall. Mallory, thank you so much. We appreciate your time. Coming up.